Sometimes the movie flops, and it's understandable. Battleship, directed by Peter Berg, Moonfall, directed by Roland Emmerich, and After Earth, directed by M. Night Shyamalan, are such examples. But then there are some movies that, arguably, were ahead of their time. It might have taken years or decades, but eventually their importance and contribution to the cinematic arts was recognized. In this video, I want to take a look at the movies that almost everybody knows, has heard of, or seen, but that, on their release, had a very frosty reception. Whether because of subject matter, outside forces, or because people didn't know what to make of it, all of these movies flopped when they were released but are now considered masterpieces of their respective genres. One could make the argument that Blade Runner is the most important movie of the 1980s. I understand that some of you will consider these fighting words. I mean, come on, the 80s were a really impressive decade for film. Raging Bull, directed by Martin Scorsese, My Neighbor Totoro, directed by Hayao Miyazaki, The Shining, directed by Stanley Kubrick, Empire Strikes Back, directed by Irvin Kershner, Terminator, directed by James Cameron, E.T. and Raiders of the Lost Ark, directed by Steven Spielberg, Die Hard, directed by John McTiernan, Sex, Lies, and Videotape, directed by Steven Soderbergh, and so on. But I don't think any 80s film has had the impact on culture as a whole, and sci-fi and cyberpunk in particular, like Blade Runner did. What Blade Runner also offered was one version of what the future might turn out to be like, with constant surveillance, megacorporations, synthetic thought, and lots of neon. We're already at 3/4 of those being a reality, with synthetic thought seemingly not far off. But though his vision is now taken for granted, when Ridley Scott's Blade Runner landed in 1982, it did not resonate with people. Blade Runner eked out $42 million on a $30 million budget, all but ensuring that it likely did not make its money back. It even put Scott in the doghouse for a few years. When 20th Century Fox wanted to make Aliens, they didn't even call him. He found out about it through James Cameron, who was given the job. There are a few reasons as to why Blade Runner flopped. One is just bad timing. 2 weeks before Blade Runner's June 25th release in 1982, Steven Spielberg released what would become the highest-grossing film of that year, E.T. the Extraterrestrial, which made close to $800 million over its entire theatrical run, nearly 20 times as much as what Blade Runner did. Before that, it was Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, another highly anticipated, widely beloved sci-fi movie. John Carpenter's The Thing came out the same day, while Tron came out just a couple of weeks later and also had a successful box office run. The summer of 1982 was a wild year for sci-fi, and Blade Runner's timing in the context of its release was about as bad as it could be. Another issue is expectation and reality. By this point, Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back had already changed the game for what a sci-fi movie could be. But despite starring Han Solo, Blade Runner did not have the same sense of optimism that Star Wars had, or the same sense of adventure of Empire. Rather, despite some calling it a thriller, it was a dark, slower-paced thinking piece that was laden with gorgeous special effects and production design. It's one of those movies that's best seen in theaters as opposed to on TV. Rotten Tomatoes consensus captured the contemporary thinking quite well. Quote, "Misunderstood when it first hit theaters, the influences of Ridley Scott's mysterious neo-noir Blade Runner has deepened with time, a visually remarkable, achingly human sci-fi masterpiece." End quote. The third reason follows from the first and second. Because of the disconnect between the expectation and reality, and because it was sandwiched between a number of iconic films, and because it was rated R, Blade Runner got lost in the conversation. Some people were talking about it, but not enough to reach critical mass. While it's done wonderfully on home video since, it would be decades before it got a sequel, Blade Runner 2049, that is also a fantastic movie that also flopped. While not everybody saw it when it was released, the right people saw it then and soon thereafter. This is what William Gibson, the cyberpunk pioneer, said of Blade Runner, quote, "I started to see that in some weird way, it was the most influential film of my lifetime up to that point. It affected the way people dressed, it affected the way people decorated nightclubs. Architects started building office buildings that you could tell they had seen in Blade Runner. It had an astonishingly broad aesthetic impact on the world," end quote. That design was the brainchild of designer Lawrence G. Paul, futurist and concept artist Sid Mead, and, of course, Ridley Scott. While Scott might have been out in the wilderness for a few years, he certainly had the last laugh. David Fincher's Fight Club, released on the cusp of the new century and new millennium, is one of the most iconic movies of the 1990s. It also had an arc that was similar to Blade Runner. The movie was frostily received and a commercial underperformer on its release, but it also more than made up for it during the post-release years, racking up a dedicated fanbase and more than breaking even thanks to home video sales. Fight Club, though hailed as a masterwork, is only slightly less controversial now than it was when it was first released. Dennis Lim, writing for the New York Times in 2009, put it well. Fight Club is a movie that, quote, today inspires obsessive, often worshipful scrutiny in both lowbrow and highbrow quarters, end quote. He went on to say that it's the defining cult movie of our time, but I'm going to disagree with him on that. That is still Blade Runner. The movie is based on the novel of the same name by Chuck Palahniuk. It's about a man who has everything that society tells him he should want, but still feels empty. Or at least, that's what appealed to Brad Pitt, who said in an interview, quote, once you get everything, then you're just left with yourself. I've said it before and I'll say it again. It doesn't help you sleep any better, and you don't wake up any better because of it, end quote. Edward Norton was drawn in for similar reasons, saying it was about a, quote, nervous anticipation of what the world was becoming and what we were expected to buy into, end quote. Generational dread is nothing new, and each generation renews old fears and faces new ones. They bear the burden of the world as it was, which creates the world as it is, which influences the world as it will be. Most people get lost in the flow of time, but there are a few that try to break out of it. One way to do so is to go underground, which isn't a bad description of what the movie did, or rather was forced to do, because despite, according to Fincher, being a satire, critics savaged it. To best understand what the leading publications of the day thought, I'll read a few choice quotes. Rex Reed, writing for The Observer, called it, quote, a film without a single redeeming quality, which may have to find its audience in hell, end quote. David Denby, writing for The New Yorker, said, quote, I think of it as a fascist rhapsody, posing as a metaphor of liberation, and I would deliver a long tirade against it if it weren't such a dog, such a laborious and foolish waste of time, end quote. Kenneth Turin, writing for the LA Times, said it was, quote, a witless mishmash of whiny, infantile philosophizing and bone-crushing violence, end quote. And, more recently, Matt Miller, writing for Esquire, said that, quote, Brad Pitt and Edward Norton's anti-consumerist film is a bunch of stylized BS, end quote. A lot of reviews accused David Fincher of being a fascist, something that strikes me as a misinterpretation considering his own contributions to President Obama's presidential campaign. Obama is a lot of things, but fascist is most certainly not one of them. Not everyone thought that way though. In fact, Janet Maslin, writing for the New York Times, wrote an, if not glowing, then at least cogent review that gives us some insight into why Fight Club has endured when so many movies haven't. Quote, if I watched sufficiently mindlessly, it might be mistaken for a dangerous endorsement of totalitarian tactics and a superviolent nihilism in an all-out assault on society, end quote, and, quote, it means to explore the lure of violence in an even more dangerously regimented, dehumanized culture. That's a hard thing to illustrate this powerfully without, so to speak, stepping on a few toes, end quote. Most people, of course, do not like having their toes stepped on. Executives at Fox, which produced and distributed the movie, didn't know how to market it or really who to market it to. They tried to pitch it as an action movie and highlight the fight scenes, but that did not gain much traction. The movie made $101 million on its $65 million budget. It, like Blade Runner, did eventually find an audience through home video. Again, it took the right people seeing it to be reappraised, though its stock has risen significantly since its release. I recall being extremely surprised that The Shawshank Redemption is the highest-ranking movie on IMDb's top 250 movies list when I first learned of IMDb. I'm still surprised, but I was too. And that Seven Samurai, arguably the best film of all time, is 22. I mean, I like all the movies in positions 1 through 21, and would go so far as to say that I love a few of them. But 22? It's nothing short of a travesty. This is the reason people say you can never trust rankings. None of that, of course, is to denigrate The Shawshank Redemption, which is an excellent film. But there's a reason that it found its way into this video. As was the case for Andy Dufresne, success was a long, unknown road. Made on a $25 million budget, the film's first release was disastrous. In its initial 10-week run, it only made around $16 million, an unqualified failure. There are some good reasons as to why that happened though. The first is that, similar to Blade Runner, The Shawshank Redemption was up against some stiff competition. Forrest Gump, released earlier that year, was in the middle of a multi-month run that saw it become the highest-grossing movie of the year. While it had an early release in September of 1994, its wide release was scheduled for October 14th. Unfortunately, the other film that came out the same day was the Palme d'Or winner Pulp Fiction, directed by Quentin Tarantino. Another is, perhaps obviously enough, The Name. The novella by Stephen King, off which the movie is based, is entitled Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption. Alas, no one knew what the hell a Shawshank was. In fact, Morgan Freeman himself blamed the title, saying, quote, "Nobody could say Shawshank Redemption. What sells anything is word of mouth." Now, your friends say, "Ah man, I saw this movie, what was it? Shink? Sham? Shim?" Something like that. Anyway, terrific. Well, that doesn't sell you, end quote. Tim Robbins, who plays Dufresne, affirmed this, saying that a fan once asked him, quote, "What was that Shawshank Redemption thing?" end quote. The fact that it was a nearly 2.5-hour film about a bleak subject matter in an even bleaker setting likely did not convince people to spend money on it, at least not during its initial run, because the right people recognized how great it was. I'm talking about the Academy of Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences, or the organization that puts on the Academy Awards. The movie earned 7 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture, Best Actor for Morgan Freeman, Best Adapted Screenplay for director Frank Darabont, and others. Despite not winning, this was a time when the Academy Awards conferred a solid bump in sales as well. The movie was re-released in early 1995 and would end its theatrical run with a comfortable $73 million, though most of that was international. The thing that most contributed to Shawshank's long-lasting legacy, though, was the immense home popularity it found. Thanks to the Academy Awards, of which Frank Darabont said, quote, "Nobody had heard of the movie, and that year on the Oscar broadcast, they were mentioning this movie 7 times, end quote. The movie became the most popular home video rental in 1995, which also contributed to robust home video sales. Add to that the fact that the movie found immense popularity in TV syndication. You couldn't turn on a TV without it being tuned in to the Shawshank Redemption. All of that relied on the fact that it was an excellent movie that connected with others, which led to them telling their friends about it, even though the theatrical window had already passed. While I'll contest it being number 1 on IMDb for the rest of my life, what's not contestable is that it's certainly one of the finest movies of the 1990s. Though not everyone has seen, most everyone has heard of Citizen Kane. Directed by the then 26-year-old wunderkind Orson Welles, it's considered to be the greatest movie ever made. It was even considered to be one of the best films ever made on the time of its release. After all, it was nominated for 9 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director, but would only pick up the win for Best Original Screenplay, written by Welles and Herman J. Mankiewicz. However, the movie never got a fair shake at the box office because it ran afoul of the most powerful person in the media industry at the time, William Randolph Hearst. Hearst ran the country's largest newspaper chain and media company, Hearst Communications, and helped pioneer a focus on yellow journalism and sensationalism. Basically, he invented clickbait before the internet was a thing. The main character, Charles Foster Kane, was only partially inspired by Hearst. Other inspirations came in the form of Joseph Pulitzer, one of Hearst's rivals, as well as some business magnates, but only Hearst took serious offense to what might have been coming his way. But what was his issue? Probably everything. Charles Foster Kane is a protagonist, but not a hero. His life mirrors Hearst's in some ways. Hearst's father was a wealthy industrialist who made his money in the mining business, and Kane's family discovers a mine with a rich gold vein. Hearst used yellow journalism to attract viewers, and so did Kane in the movie. Hearst ran for and lost a race for governor of New York, same with Kane. Though perhaps most problematic was the depiction of Marion Davies, Hearst's mistress. Citizen Kane had Susan Alexander Kane, which many thought was based on Davies, and the association would prove damaging for Davies' career. Susan Kane was an untalented singer that Charles Kane tries to promote, something that people thought Hearst was doing for Davies. Welles himself disputed this claim and tried to clear it up, but after the movie came out, the damage was done. Now, keep in mind that William Randolph Hearst owns dozens of newspapers in some of the largest markets in the United States. And not just newspapers, but magazines and radio stations as well. In a time when TV wasn't as big of a thing as it is now, this is how people learned about stuff. Hearst and his subordinates would use that leverage to form a conspiracy of silence around Citizen Kane and actively try to damage Welles' career. To get a sense of how bad it got, a police investigator once told Orson Welles on the cusp of the release of Citizen Kane, quote, "Don't go back to your hotel. They've got a 14-year-old girl in the closet and 2 photographers waiting for you to come in," end quote. They also tried to brand him as a communist. This was a few years after HUAC, or the House Committee on Un-American Activities, was formed and would try to suppress speech in the United States. J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, launched an investigation into Welles as well. They even tried to buy the negative in order to burn it. but they never attacked the movie. Hearst decided that saying nothing would be the most damaging thing, and he was right. There was no mention of Citizen Kane in his outlets. No reviews, no denials, no denigrations, nothing. Some theaters refused to show it on account of cowardice in deference to William Randolph Hearst. Even the distributor, RKO, was hesitant to release it, only doing so when Wells offered to buy the picture from them and release it himself. They gave it virtually no marketing, all but guaranteeing a disastrous box office. Not everyone was a coward. It received acclaim from the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Yorker, the Nation, Newsweek, and others. It was enough to get some people in the large metro areas to see it, but not enough. The film, made on an $840,000 budget, lost more than $150,000 on its initial run. It wasn't until it was rediscovered by critics like Andre Bazin and Andrew Saris and began to get TV airplay in the 50s that the film's reputation began to grow, eventually reaching the pinnacle that it's at today. Hearst may have won the battle, but Orson Welles would win the war. Hearst would forever be associated with Citizen Kane. When one of Hearst's sons died, some headlines even read, "Son of Citizen Kane dies." In 2012, the Hearst estate would screen Citizen Kane at Hearst Castle. The wall had crumbled. Wells had the final word 71 years after the film's release. There's a reason John Carpenter is hailed as one of the best filmmakers of all time. The guy constantly puts out bangers. Whether or not they're appreciated in their own time is irrelevant. Nearly all of them have found critical acclaim over the years. His filmography is insane. Assault on Precinct 13 in 1976, Halloween in 1978, Escape from New York in 1981, which also helped give us Solid Snake, The Thing in 1982, the same year that Blade Runner came out, Christine in 1983, Big Trouble in Little China in 1986, and They Live in 1988. There's not a filmmaker alive that hasn't been influenced by Carpenter at this point. But I want to talk about one of his most famous flops, 1982's The Thing. Based on John W. Campbell Jr.'s novella, Who Goes There, the movie is about some researchers in Antarctica that encounter an alien that can imitate other people. And, similar to many other films, it was disparaged on its release before finding success thanks to TV syndication and home video releases. Critics were really brutal to it. Here are some choice quotes. Vincent Canby, writing for the New York Times, said it was a, quote, foolish, depressing, overproduced movie, end quote, and that, quote, it qualifies only as instant junk, end quote. Alan Spencer at Starlog, a magazine that was focused on sci-fi, wrote that Carpenter wasn't qualified to direct sci-fi and should only direct, quote, traffic accidents, train wrecks, and public floggings, end quote. Linda Gross at the LA Times said that, quote, the film is so frigid and devoid of feeling that death no longer has any meaning, end quote, while David Anson at Newsweek said it was, quote, sacrificing everything at the altar of gore, end quote. All of these reviews are weird because, in their full context, it seems as though they expected it to be a warm, fuzzy, charming, and uplifting movie. Why is that the case? Because of E.T., which literally came out just 2 weeks before The Thing. E.T. was beloved, hailed as a masterpiece, and was the highest-grossing movie of the year. Every review of The Thing was in the context of E.T. Steven Spielberg, unknowingly, had screwed John Carpenter, who was shocked by the reception to his film. In Carpenter's words, quote, I take every failure hard. The one I took the hardest was The Thing. My career would have been different if that had been a big hit, end quote. Of course, things were a lot different in the years after its release, after it was reevaluated as a masterpiece. Now it's considered one of the greatest horror or sci-fi movies ever made, one of the best movies of the 80s bar none, and has been influential for a number of directors like Guillermo del Toro and Neil Blomkamp. It's called comfort for Carpenter, who considers it his favorite film that he directed, but whose career was severely derailed by it. Still, better later than never. 2006's Children of Men is a bit like the Shawshank Redemption and Citizen Kane, not in the fact that it had a powerful media magnate refuse to let his papers talk about it. No, like those two movies, Alfonso Cuarón's masterpiece was hailed as such upon its release. It was considered either the best movie of 2006 or one of the best movies of 2006, and according to a BBC survey of more than 100 film critics conducted in 2016, it is the 13th best film of the 21st century. Children of Men is a dystopian view of a future that, according to Cuarón, presents a hopeful or pessimistic view depending on your personality. In his words, quote, we wanted the end to be a glimpse of a possibility of hope, for the audience to invest their own sense of hope into that ending. So, if you're a hopeful person, you'll see a lot of hope, and if you're a bleak person, you'll see a complete hopelessness at the end, end quote. Based on P.D. James' 1992 novel, The Children of Men, the movie is about society brought to the brink of collapse thanks to ecocide and mass human infertility. Now, these aren't exactly happy topics, and while it shares some dystopian sense with Blade Runner, Cuarón wanted it to be the anti-Blade Runner. The effects were there to enhance the story, not replace it, as is the case for many sci-fi movies. However, distributor Universal Studios was at a loss. How were they supposed to sell such a movie? The movie lacked a clear marketing strategy. James Hoberman, writing for The Village Voice, wrote in his review of the movie that Universal dropped the ball when marketing 12 Monkeys, and they did it again with Children of Men. Quote, with a bare minimum of advanced screenings and a total absence of hype, the studio dumped it. This year, they've done it again, end quote. Despite its limited release, the movie made $70.5 million on its $75 million budget. With a bit more consideration, it likely could have at least broken even. Children of Men is one of those movies who, despite being critically acclaimed on its release, has continued to gain respect. The 21st century, especially since 2006, has proven to be difficult, and much of that difficulty is reflected in themes present in Children of Men, especially as they pertain to immigration, and specifically European immigration, more recent in the fore, declining birth rates around the world. Abraham Reisman, writing for Vulture, may have put it best, saying that it, quote, might be the most relevant film of our dark new century, end quote. Flops are common in Hollywood, and, in some cases, it takes decades for a film to be appreciated for what it is, a landmark and masterpiece. Despite each of these movies flopping, all of them have won a hard-fought battle in the ultimate canon of film. Now, no matter how long into the future we look, they'll be respected as the classics and important contributions that they are.